Someone was living in my walls, and I didn't know for months. The scratching sounds. The first time Claire heard it, she was half asleep. A faint scratching sound, barely audible over the hum of the city outside. She told herself it was just the wind rattling the old pipes. Or maybe mice. The apartment was old, drafty, and lived in, the kind of place that carried whispers of past tenants. But the scratching didn't stop. Every night, just past midnight, it returned. Soft at first, like nails against wood. Then deliberate, rhythmic, a pattern that made the hair on her arms rise. One night, she followed the sound. Her bare feet pressed against the cold floor as she traced the noise to the kitchen. The fridge light hummed when she opened it. Something was off, half a sandwich missing, juice bottle moved. She frowned but dismissed it. Maybe she had forgotten. But then it happened again. Small, almost unnoticeable changes. The spoon not where she left it, her blanket slightly shifted in the morning, dust gathering in places it shouldn't. The vents especially. The metal slats seemed dirtier than before, like something was moving inside. Claire tried to ignore it, but unease crept into her bones. She started double-checking everything before bed, locking the fridge, placing her keys in exact spots. And yet, by morning, something always felt off. Finally, she needed answers. She bought a small camera, set it up in the living room, and pointed it toward the kitchen. She told herself it was paranoia, that she'd wake up and laugh at her own foolishness. That night, she forced herself to sleep. But the scratching returned, closer this time, deeper. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself not to listen. Morning came, and with shaking hands, Claire checked the footage. The screen flickered to life, showing her darkened apartment. Hours passed with nothing. Then movement. A vent cover ever so slowly slid open. A pair of pale, thin hands gripped the edge. Claire's breath hitched as she watched. A figure gaunt, shadowy, eyes gleaming in the dim light, crawled out. Moving with unnatural slowness, it unfolded itself from the vent, bones shifting under skin. And then it turned toward the camera. It had been watching her, and now it knew she had seen it. The hidden passage. Ethan stood in the doorway of his new home, inhaling the scent of aged wood and dust. The house was old, older than any place he'd ever lived, but that was part of the charm. It had character, history. A fixer-upper, the realtor had called it. Hidden gem. For the first few nights, everything seemed normal. Sure, the floorboards creaked unpredictably, and cold drafts whispered through the hallways, but that was expected in a house this old. Then the oddities began. A strange, musty smell clung to the air, strongest in the study. It wasn't mildew or rot, but something stale, something human. One evening, as he ran his fingers over the built-in bookshelf, a sharp draft swept across his skin. Ethan frowned. The house had no air vents in this room. He pressed his palm flat against the wood and felt the faintest vibration, like space behind it. Curious, he pushed. With a low groan, the bookshelf shifted. Dust cascaded from the edges as it revealed a narrow, hidden doorway. Ethan hesitated before stepping inside. The crawl space was tight, the air thick with neglect. A single, flickering bulb hung from the ceiling, casting long, distorted shadows. Against the farthest wall, a small makeshift bed, a sleeping bag, crumpled and stained. Next to it, a pile of half-eaten food, long since rotted. His stomach twisted. Then he saw the journal. It lay open, the pages curled at the edges, ink smudged in places. His fingers trembled as he flipped to the last entry. He still doesn't know I'm here. The breath left his lungs. The words swam before his eyes. His mind raced. How old is this? How long ago was this written? Then, a sound, soft, deliberate, from inside the walls. Ethan turned, heart hammering, eyes scanning the shadows. A slow, creeping realization took hold. The food wasn't that old. The sleeping bag wasn't covered in dust. And the journal, the ink was fresh. Somewhere in the darkness, something shifted. He wasn't alone. The whispering walls. Maya had always been sensitive to sounds. As a child, she would lie awake listening to the hum of the house settling, the creaks of old beams, the wind brushing against the windows. But lately, the noises had become more deliberate. At first, she shrugged it off. The whispers in her bedroom walls were probably just the house shifting, or the wind sneaking through the cracks in the old plaster. It wasn't the first time she'd heard strange sounds at night, especially in her new room, the one at the far end of the house. But then they started calling her name. Maya. Soft, like a whisper carried on a breeze. Maya. There it was again, deeper this time, as if it came from within the walls themselves. She sat up in bed, eyes darting toward the corner where the voices seemed to originate. Her heartbeat quickened. She told herself it was nothing, just her imagination. But night after night, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They followed her, shifting from one wall to the next, as if tracking her movements. One night, she could take it no longer. The voice, her name, was so clear now, so insistent. Maya rose from her bed, heart thumping, and tiptoed toward the wall closest to her bed. The air felt cold against her skin as she pressed her ear to the old plaster. And then, breathing. Slow, deep, raspy breaths that seemed to come from the very bones of the house. Maya's breath hitched in her throat. She could feel the pulse of something alive behind the walls, something close, something watching. The sound was too real, too close. She pulled away in panic. The next morning, she found a note slipped under her bedroom door. Its edges were ragged, the handwriting jagged, almost frantic. Stop listening. Her blood ran cold. The message wasn't a prank. It was too personal, too specific. She stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the note as a chill ran down her spine. Maya didn't know what to make of it. Who would do this? Who knew? And who or what was on the other side of her walls? The eyes in the vents. Eric's apartment was small, but it suited his needs. A place to sleep, eat, and most importantly, escape the chaos of his night shifts. The hours were long and grueling, but the quiet solitude of his apartment was the perfect retreat. Or at least it had been. Lately, something was off. It started with small things. His bed, when he returned from work, was slightly unmade, just enough to be noticeable. His toothbrush, which he was sure he'd left dry, was damp. The shower, always dry when he left, had water droplets on the tiles. He told himself it was just his tired mind playing tricks. But the feeling lingered. Each night, as he sank into bed after his shift, the air felt wrong. He couldn't shake the sense that something was watching him, waiting for him to sleep. The small hairs on the back of his neck prickled, and the silence in the apartment felt too heavy. One evening, after returning to a particularly unsettling night, Eric had had enough. The unease that clung to him like a shadow couldn't be ignored any longer. He needed proof, something to explain the creeping suspicion that had taken root in his mind. He installed a baby monitor in his bedroom, positioning it so it covered the entire room, including the air vent by the far wall. He had read online that strange sounds in vents were common, and perhaps it was just the old building settling. But there was a nagging thought that told him there was something more. At 3 a.m., the monitor beeped. Eric jolted awake, heart pounding in his chest. He turned on the monitor's display, his eyes blurry from exhaustion. For a moment, the screen showed nothing but the dim light of his room. Then, in the far corner, the movement caught his eye. A pale, gaunt face peeked from inside the vent. The features were distorted, twisted, almost otherworldly, and the eyes were wide, unnaturally large, locked on him. The face didn't move, but it watched. Eric's breath hitched. He froze, staring at the screen in horror, trying to process what he was seeing. The figure was barely there, a hollow, translucent presence that flickered in and out of focus. His blood ran cold as he realized it had been there, watching him sleep every night. He quickly rewound the footage. The face appeared again, each time growing clearer, more defined. Eric's mind raced. What the hell is that thing? The figure's eyes never left him. They seemed to peer into his very soul, as if it knew him, knew his every fear. And as the camera captured the last flicker of the face before it vanished back into the vent, Eric heard a faint whisper, too soft to understand, but chilling all the same. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. He knew without a doubt that whatever had been lurking inside those vents was still out there, and it had been watching him for far longer than he realized. The final confrontation. The Miller family had always dreamed of a suburban life. The house, a charming two-story nestled on a quiet street, was perfect for them. The kids had their rooms, the backyard was spacious, and the neighborhood was peaceful. Everything seemed ideal, too ideal. It all started innocuously enough. Strange footprints appeared in the attic, small, muddy tracks that couldn't be explained. At first, Sarah thought it was a sign of pests or rodents, but there were no droppings or signs of infestation. She called pest control, but they found nothing. The footprints continued to appear day after day. Each morning, there were more, always leading from the far corner of the attic to the crawl space in the wall. It was as if something or someone was moving through the house without a trace. That's when the sounds began. Late one night, while the family slept, Jake Miller, the father, was jolted awake by a noise from the walls. Soft scratching, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone moving. He turned to Sarah, but she was deep in sleep. The sounds continued, slow, deliberate, as if something was crawling within the walls of the house. Jake couldn't ignore it anymore. He had to know what was happening. He grabbed a hammer and made his way to the area where the sound seemed most concentrated, the wall just beyond the living room. With a few solid strikes, the drywall cracked open. The sound of his hammer was drowned by an eerie silence. As the dust settled, Jake peered inside the hole, his breath catching in his throat. Hidden room. The space was small, barely large enough to stand in. Faint moonlight filtered in through the crack, revealing an emaciated figure huddled in the far corner. At first, Jake thought it was some kind of mannequin or trick of the light, but then the figure moved. Slowly, painfully, it shifted toward the hole in the wall. A gaunt man, pale and malnourished, his skin stretched tight over bones. His eyes were wide, fevered, filled with something other than fear, recognition. Before Jake could react, the man spoke, his voice rasping, almost a whisper. "You were never supposed to find me." Jake stumbled back, his heart racing. The air in the room felt suffocating, heavy with the weight of an unspeakable truth. The man's hollow eyes met his, and Jake knew, without a doubt, that this was no coincidence. This was something far darker than he could have imagined. The man's lips trembled as he continued. "I've been watching you, waiting for you to find me. But now, it's too late." Jake's pulse pounded in his ears. He turned to run, but the man reached out, a skeletal hand gripping the edge of the hole, pulling himself closer. Everything in Jake's world froze. Time seemed to stretch, the air thick with dread. And then, the silence was shattered by a low, guttural laugh.